Hey everyone, welcome back. You all did a great job on your first week's reading response. For those of you who are history majors and have taken some upper level classes, I hope last week's short reading was a nice reminder about some of the fundamentals of studying history. And for those of you who are taking an upper level history course for the first time, I hope it was a useful introduction. I was happy that a number of you wrote about something that makes history different from the hard sciences, right? History is hard, as Cronin explains, because we can never replicate a historical event like we can a scientific experiment. Right? If we think that a president's charisma allowed him to pass a particular piece of legislation, we can't run an experiment where we remove a president's charisma and see if the legislation still passes. So as a number of you pointed out, right, our research is largely restricted to historical documents. And we call these primary sources. And these will be essential for you once we get into your own research in a few weeks. And we'll get into primary sources more as we move along, but if you haven't heard that term before, here is just a good basic definition of a primary source from the University of California, Berkeley. Basically, a primary sources were either created during the time period being studied, or were created at a later date by a participant in the events being studied. So I'll say that one more time. Primary sources were either created during the time period being studied, or were created at a later date by participants in the event being studied. So an example of a primary source maybe created at a later date by a participant in an event might be a memoir or even an interview. Another assumption that a few of you wrote about, but I want to point out, is the fact that we're not interested in broad generalizations that can be applied more or less universally without regard to time or place. And what that means is that historians aren't interested in finding laws about human behavior. And so when we get into your research project, you want to avoid claims like, that's just human nature, or people just act that way when. Another assumption that Cronin wrote about, and only a few of you included in your responses, so I just want to talk about it quickly, in part because it provides a nice transition into our reading for this week. Cronin writes on, I'm going to scroll down. Cronin writes that historians believe that we can never be truly objective. At the very least, our concerns about the present influence the questions we ask about the past and the features that of the past that we focus on. And so he writes that, because all history is inevitably written from a particular point of view, we assume that history is closely tied to present politics. Far from worrying that this will taint our scholarship, we usually embrace the chance to explore history's relevance to issues unfolding in our own time. So I want to just clarify something here because it's easy to misinterpret this. Cronin isn't arguing that we just assume that history will be written to advance maybe liberal or conservative causes. Instead, he's suggesting that present-day politics will often influence what we study about the past. Right, so our current political debates over immigration, for example, might spark historians to ask questions about the origins of our current immigration policies or where our current rhetoric comes from. Above all, though, we try to get as close as possible to the truth, whether that leads us to conclusions that are useful to conservatives or liberals. And that's what separates us from political pundits. We don't start with a conclusion and look for evidence to support that conclusion. We begin with a question, like what are the origins of immigration restriction? And then we examine the evidence and develop conclusions based on that evidence. And so in this week's reading, though, we're going to study how history is used by non-historians. And we're going to examine what we call popular memory or popular history, which usually isn't produced by professional historians. And we're going to read a great book called A More Beautiful and Terrible History about the popular memory of the civil rights movement. And this type of memory generally isn't in search of the truth, right, which is the goal of historians. This type of memory uses the past to advance a particular political or social goal. So it generally isn't concerned with whether the interpretation of the past or their interpretation of the past is accurate or not. What you're going to find in the book is that most of what we know about the civil rights movement is wrong. And you're going to learn that there are political reasons behind that. And so this type of historical research is fun because you get to study BS. Right? Usually when we study history, we're interested in accuracy. And so if we find a document that's inaccurate, we might discard it. But when we study popular memory, we often get to make the inaccurate stuff we find the center of our story, which is a lot of fun. We get to study people who are trying to fabricate just a completely false interpretation of history. And we get to try to figure out why they are doing this. And so to lead you through this book, if I can get my cursor here. To lead you through this book, I've posted 10 reading response questions, and you should take a look at these before you start reading, because I didn't simply make these to make sure that you read the book. It's not just about accountability. I crafted these to help you figure out the most important points in the book, and you should write at least a paragraph in response to these questions. That might sound like a lot, but remember that we're not meeting in class for 3 hours a week, like a standard face-to-face course. And so this is the type of close reading and response that's necessary to really set us up to do the research section of this course. As always, please email me with any questions about the reading. We can also set up a phone call or a Skype meeting to talk about any part of the reading that might confuse you, or even a part of the reading that just caught your attention and you just really want to talk more about it.